through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death and it stared back.
Welcome to Studium to Studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican chapter and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
Jessica Sanders, and Becky See.
Hey, we got a room full of Dominicans today, and it's going to take that to talk about the person that we're going to be discussing. He is considered the undisputed universal doctor, the universal genius, Albertus Magnus, and St. Albert the Great. Those are a few of his titles. And but he's there's a lot of mystery around him and difficult to find some of his information. Some of his works have not been translated into English. So we're going to just discuss what we found and trying to learn more about our patron of our chapter. There's one quote that I wanted to share that's by Joseph Wimmer. He says that Albertus Magnus has studied and described the entire cosmos from stone to stars. And I don't know about you all, but that's the impression that I got in doing my research for this.
I agree with you. There's been quite a few quotes that have, and we could talk about them for a long time, but this way it leaves people wanting to know more and read more about him.
Definitely. Well, one of the books that I read about St. Albert the Great is by Dr. Kevin Vost. It's called St. Albert the Great, Champion of Faith and Reason. And it is from there that I've drawn most of what I've learned about him, including this quote by Pope Pius XI. It says, "To him," meaning St. Albert the Great, "belongs this great honor, that, excepting St. Thomas, there is scarcely another doctor of equal authority, whether in philosophy, theology, or the interpretation of Scripture. It would be an endless task to recount all that Albert has done for the increase of theological science, and indeed, it was to theology that the whole trend of his mind was inevitably directed." So, any thoughts about St. Albert in his theological work?
Go ahead.
I think one of the, just in studying and just learning a little bit of St. Albert the Great, he's also called the universal genius. And, him being a student first and then being the teacher that he was, one of the things that, just on a personal level that I can relate to my own self as being a teacher of the faith, just basically how he had such great pursuit in teaching his students and just a passion to merge, faith and reason together, and just to look at God's creation and just a whole new sense of, or not necessarily new, but he saw he saw the newness, I guess, in God's creation, and just he saw beyond what the physical eye could see in God's God's saving hand in the world. And so I think just with the in-depth knowledge that when we read about St. Albert the Great, it seems a little bit of sometimes over my own head, my own personal, what I could truly come to understand. But just personally, I think just the way he pursued God, even in the things that maybe the human mind couldn't grasp, just the faith that he had to see beyond what was just right in front of him, to go into the divine of who God is
and to go into the divine through natural science, right? I mean, he really not only natural science, of course, he studied metaphysics and made biblical commentaries and everything, but his fascination, his natural instinct was that of a naturalist, really, to observe nature but to always see God in that, not just as an end in itself.
And it's a lot of the science as well. He liked studying about plants. His works led to the chemistry, and also he embraced a holistic vision of knowledge, recognizing that interconnectedness of the different branches of our learning. And that set him apart as a thinker who appreciated the unit of truth.
He also wrote about virtue, which he has a book called, what is that?
So it's called The Paradise of the Soul, and it's 42 virtues to reach heaven, written by St. Albert the Great. And he had this philosophy of of finding the middle of two extremes, otherwise known as the golden mean, where you look at two extremes, and in this case you look at virtue and vice. And so his goal in terms of virtue is finding that middle ground between the two extremes, of course, erring on the side of virtue, but also bringing to the fact that where you have one virtue, you could also have a vice, and if taken to the furthest extreme. And so in this book, he talks about 42 different virtues, and just in a couple of them, I think that we all can relate to. And out of the 42, I just looked at discretion, which is quite interesting, because many people look at discretion and as a virtue, and then say, well, that's really prudence. But what it is really going a little bit deeper, such as how much is a good thing to be desired and how much any bad thing is to be avoided, or how much reverence a person ought to give to a leader, and how much clemency a leader should extend to their subordinates. I mean, it goes to, in a very simple fashion, but in a very prayerful fashion, how to find that true virtue that's going to ultimately get us to heaven. And that's what his goals are with regard to trying not to fall into vice. But for example, he says we may slip and fall from humility into pride or vainglory, or from patience into anger, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of each chapter, which are very short, he gives a little prayer for each virtue. So if you're looking for something to read that is very similar to a Imitation of Christ, which is very easy reading, short paragraphs, but really powerful and prayerful and spiritual reflections, Paradise of the Soul by St. Albert the Great is something to consider.
Well, and you mentioned that the golden mean, and that's something that I believe Aristotle put forward. So it's probably a good time to mention that St. Albert and St. Thomas were champions of helping to get Aristotle's work more correctly translated into their vernacular. And they forwarded a lot of the documents, even including some of the commentaries from other cultures that made sense and promoted truth. And they did get into a lot of heat for that, which, especially with St. Thomas after his death, many people kind of attacked some of his philosophies that he wrote because particularly they considered someone named Averroes, who he quoted frequently in the Summa, as someone who was had heretical thoughts and philosophies. But Albert came to his defense. He came to Paris and he defended St. Thomas's writings, and he went to Cologne and defended his writings, and his Dominican brethren then said no one is to fault St. Thomas for any of his writings, and that we would promulgate it and continue to use them to study. And as we know, that was also vindicated in the future, right? We know now that his writings are probably one of the most referenced writings in the church for over 1,000 years now. Well, almost 1,000 years now.
And with the work of using what was thought of as pagan principles that were used by Aristotle and such, it was it's neat to see how Saint Albert took those pagan principles along with Saint Thomas and used those to explain the sacred, and that there was no separation between faith and reason, between the creator and the creation. And one of the quotes or some of the words that were used by St. Albert himself in the view of nature, he said that the whole world is theology for us because the heavens proclaim the glory of God.
Oh, nice. Well, one thing, Jeff, you mentioned discretion. We know he had to use a lot of discretion. He not only was this amazing scientist that we're talking about, and we'll get more into that, volumes and volumes and volumes written about zoology, astronomy, botany, I think you mentioned that, Becky, and several other things. But he was actually called several times by the Pope for diplomatic services. So I really thought it was humorous. In this book by Dr. Vos, he gives a really funny analogy, saying that imagine that we're embroiled in a war, and like Albert Einstein is alive, and he's in the middle of some major research, on physics, particle physics, whatever, and the president stops him to come deal with New York and its problems, like going under, difficulty, get them out of. In this funny story, he ends with, of course, seems ridiculous, but somehow Albert Einstein manages to do this in 2 years and then goes back to his studies. This actually happened with St. Albert the Great. He was in the middle of his studies, deep in teaching, and he was sent to, the Pope asked him to come to Ratisbon, which is now Regensburg, and to work out this horrible situation where the diocese had been driven into poverty. They were in debt, and actually Blessed Humbert, who was the Master General at the time, tried to keep him. We have the letters from him saying, "Please don't go. We need you here," begging him. But Albert was called by a papal bull, and he responded in obedience to the Pope and went to become, for 2 years, the Bishop of Ratisbon. He was known as Bishop Boots, which is sort of meant to be a derogatory term because he would walk everywhere he went. As a Dominican, he continued to live his faithfully, his obedience as a Dominican, and they walked wherever they went. So Albert was known as Bishop Boots as he walked he was a very fit man, my understanding, because he walked everywhere. So anyway, in 2 years, he worked out all the problems. He came up with a lot of ideas, and he inspired a lot of the leaders to come back together and work together. And then he went back to his studies. I mean, it's just an amazing, it's endless, the amazing, there should be a movie about him. I think we need to work on that. Because it's almost, and Becky, you were saying that the Blessed Virgin Mary had helped St. Albert.
Right. Mr. Vos talked about it in an article he had written, and that there were legends about the young Albert not being a really whiz kid, perhaps providing hope for those with average intelligence. Well, he had a hard time learning science, is what the legend says, and then he'd go to bed and we'd wake up the next morning and not remember anything of what he did. But then one day his room shone brightly as St. Catherine and the Holy Virgin Mary suddenly appeared before him. The Blessed Mother asked what he desired, and Albert responded, asking her for the vast knowledge of human wisdom. Well, so then one day after that, the Blessed Mother responded that she would give him philosophical learning without equal. And she told Albert that this human knowledge would never draw him away from his faith. But finally she told him that before the end of his life on earth, that his knowledge would leave him and he would return to God as simple and innocent as a child.
Wow. And we know he did. We won't, we'll go ahead and go into that, I guess, and because we're going to move back and forth here in his life. Mm-hmm. Since you mentioned that, though, he, the last couple of years, he just suddenly lost his memory. He recalled this saying and told someone about it, and he also wrote his will. And then he passed away in November 15th of 1280. 80, yeah. And, so I believe they exhumed his body 3 years later, and it was mostly intact. And he was laying face down because that's the way he prayed. And there was the smell of roses, which is often occurs with saintly exhumations of sites where they've been buried. So amazing stuff. It keeps going on. What are some other thoughts about St. Albert that you all picked up?
Well, with St. Albert being such a wonderful teacher, obviously teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas, and really did talk about faith and science and how the two do go together. And even today, there is an organization. It's based out of the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. It's called the St. Thomas Initiative. And as very timely as this show is, that initiative is coming to New Orleans on February 2nd. And what it is, it brings high schoolers together who are interested in science and in faith. And you have to be invited. The schools are invited. And the discussion focuses on different aspects of science. And just like the different aspects that St. Thomas had, covering all areas of science, this St. Albert initiative covers all aspects of science as well. And as a matter of fact, one of our own local Dominicans here in the St. Albert the Great chapter, Dr. Mike Totaro, who teaches at University of Louisiana here in Lafayette, he will be one of the speakers for this initiative. And so, even to this day, St. Albert the Great has a significant impact on what's taking place, and I think a revitalization of his work, of his interests, of his teachings, and his initiatives are even being felt to this day. So if you're interested, go. There's a website at the University of Notre Dame talking about the St. Albert Initiative. So to learn more, you can go to that and see how St. Albert still has an impact in today's world.
Well, I can say that I was a laboratory scientist for 32 years. And during that 32 years, I did find out who the patron saint of science was, and that was St. Albert the Great. Well, then right there at the end of my 32 years, I decided to become a lay Dominican. And lo and behold, it's the St. Albert the Great chapter. So things just fit in one after the other.
Never by just coincidence,
No.
I don't think. Yes, Pope Pius XII, was the one that declared St. Albert the patron saint of scientists. He also was a third order Dominican. I did not know that. So Pope St. Pius XII, or Pope Pius XII. I'm not sure he's been. And then, so it took a long time for him to be canonized, though, is what I looked at the timeline. And as I mentioned earlier, St. Thomas had died at a young age of 49, and I think St. Albert outlived him by about 6 years, in which time I mentioned that he defended St. Thomas's work. And I think that St. Thomas, he became a saint in 1323, and it wasn't until 1931 that our St. Albert the Great actually finalized his canonization and was declared a doctor of the church as well that year. And that was by Pope Pius XI.
You're listening to Catholic Radio for Acadiana, Christ Our King Radio. It's a 90.5 FM and 99.5 FM, 1230 AM. We are your third order Dominicans, or lay Dominicans, here based out of Lafayette, Louisiana, at Our Lady of Wisdom Church. And this is Studium to Studio. And every Thursday at 4 p.m., you can hear our show here on this station. And we thank you for listening, and we thank Stein Lumber for their support that we were able to bring you the fruits of our contemplation to you. So Stein Lumber, thank you so much. Locations throughout Acadiana. And, what is interesting is talking about St. Albert the Great, he was so involved in so many different things, but, not only just science, but also writings on theology, commentaries to the Bible. And I think Jessica, you had mentioned, friendship, and something that you thought was very interesting, either in your own life or in St. Albert the Great's life, with regard to friendship. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I just, his friendship, that he established between him and St. Thomas Aquinas, brought together in this extraordinary path, and sharing of great minds that they had, and likewise, just to have someone with him to share in that likeness. And there's a few things that were just said about their holy friendship as teacher and student, but yet two of the great minds of the church just coming together and just not only paving a way of their own friendship, but also helping to preach and lead others into this path of friendship between the human and divine. And I think one of the things, when studying and reading about St. Albert the Great, is that, I have to remind my own self, a lot of the things that he wrote and, so in depth, just kind of hard to grasp at times to come to a full understanding, just because of such an in-depth mind that he had for knowledge, is that, he, like all of us, turned to God, he in personal prayer. Frequent reception of the sacraments, because at one point, when I'm reading about it, I'm thinking, oh wow, just a universal genius, and how can I relate to St. Albert? But just reminding of the simple things that he did in life, was just simple prayer. Frequent reception of the sacraments, the Holy Mass. And it was through those moments and those simple moments, it is then, when he was just infused with great knowledge and love of God, and which led to such extraordinary findings in life, and just again a greater meaning and a deeper meaning of the faith, and just coming to know who God is not just on a level of knowledge, but just on a personal level for the Lord.
And when I was looking and talking about friendship, there's this section in Dr. Vo's book where he emphasizes his peacemaking skills again. I'd mentioned previously that he had gone to be an excellent bishop and to recover a diocese, but he also had to make peace between a lot of bishops and their towns, because at that time there was this great divide between power. And so Albert was constantly sent to, especially Cologne, where he is considered Albert of Cologne because that's where he spent most of his time teaching and living. And he would go there to bring about peace, because there was a particular archbishop, I think it's Conrad, it just were in a heated boil with the local township and so forth, and so much to the point that they were really at war. Albert had to step in, I believe, 3 times to bring peace in Cologne until finally the death of the archbishop came, and they didn't have as many problems after that. But at any rate, Albert, one thing that he had several quotes that I found, and there's one that's attributed to him, and this is why I think he was such a good person chosen in diplomacy and French and what we think of in friendship. He says, "To forgive those who have injured us in body and reputation, our goods, is more advantageous to us than to cross the seas to go to venerate the sepulchre of our Lord." So, in other words, rather than just go on pilgrimage, even that is not as good as just to forgive someone for an offense. And these are the types of the heart of the man that we're talking about, a colossal giant in intellect, but a kind soul. As a matter of fact, I love the story when he was a boy. Evidently, he was just very peaceful of heart and mind, and joyful. And there was the white horse of Lewingen. So he was born in Lewingen. We think around 1200. Again, records are a little scant, but he was known. This horse was known to not be able to be tamed. It was wild, but Albert was the only one it would follow. He would go up as a boy and be able to walk it places where no other person was able to tame it. And I just think that's another example of his spirit and docility.
Pope Benedict actually spoke of his friendship as well. The friendship of reason and faith. He said that St. Albert's realization that the reason and scripture are completely compatible, and of God's will that we are to use both to seek and attain truth and happiness.
So one story about St. Albert the Great was when he was a young boy, and he took his younger brother to the manger, to the stalls where the animals were, in somebody else's farmhouse that had animals, because they had heard, this was on Christmas Eve, they'd heard that the animals could talk on Christmas Eve. They had a special grace. So St. Albert, the consummate observer and scientist, went out to test this theory. They did get in trouble for this because the farmer discovered them. His brother tried to console him in saying that you're probably right. They in your observations, but even though he didn't get to hear them talking. So Albert, his brother, actually became a Dominican and was a prior of one of the priories in Germany where Albert resided near his death to do more studies. And Jessica, you were saying that, he's known for naming mineralogy, right? Mineralogy?
Right. Just no one had ever, up until that point, in St. Albert the Great's life, that he used the term, or he discovered minerals, and using the term mineralism, and that was a first ever, in that point in time, that he was the first scientist, so to speak, that they said he had discovered.
Wow. And also, so Dr. Vos mentioned some of St. Albert's samples of his specific scientific contribution. So I'll give some of them to you so you get an idea of how amazing he was. He isolated arsenic. He provided the first description of the spinach plant in Western writing. He did early work in the theory of protective coloration of animals, including the prediction that animals in the extreme north would have white coloring. He determined that the Milky Way is a huge assemblage of stars. Nobody thought of that before. He determined that the figures visible on the moon were not reflections of the Earth's mountains and seas, but features of the moon's own surface. He predicted land masses at the Earth's poles. He predicted a large landmass to the west of Europe, and he determined, with the use of mathematical formulae, that the Earth was spherical. These are just a few, of the many, many accomplishments and his observations. And you said mineralogy. I know I've read somewhere where still scientists marvel at the impact that book that he wrote on minerals has had on science.
And you look back on what was taking place during that time, and what people thought was science or was not science, but wasn't there another story where people believed that spiders could not survive a fire? And I think he tested that pretty quickly, didn't he?
He did. He did test that out with a spider and found that was not true, but he did make some observations that were interesting about that.
And then another one you said about the white coloring in the animals.
Yes.
That theory came to fruition first through the polar bear.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Wow. Thank you for listening, and go find out some more about our patron saint, St. Albert, who is an amazing saint. And remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death, and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard. I rattled in the wind like a window pane. My soul's alright, but my body...